Knowing an idea is like knowing a person. Knowing a domain of knowledge is like meeting a community of people. I first read this in a book called Mindstorms by Seymour Papert. It's a really great book. If you haven't read it, check it out. It's all about the vision for how computers and technology could support children in their learning. I highly recommend it. What I find is a lot of people around me, adults mainly, have a way of talking about certain ideas as if they were getting to know a person. They speak about how this person came up with this first concept, but then they had a conversation with them and then it got improved, or they discredited some part of it but didn't agree with it, and then it evolved. And this is very different to how children think about their ideas. They think about, well, this would just get me the grade. I could solve 10 out of 5 questions. Um, and I think there's something very wrong or not so great about that. It doesn't build in this affective or emotional relationship to learning. And that's really what this video is about, is me experimenting in how I can build this into my own learning and personal knowledge management system. So instead of kind of wrestling with abstract concepts and just leaving it in the ether, I decided to create the LINX. And the LINX is really a dojo for understanding. It's a place for me to try and digest my knowledge and not just to be a passive receiver of it. Like when you're listening to a podcast or a book, you might just kind of be letting it into your ears. This is the go-to um, note taker for new concepts. I also have my notes section, which is slightly separate, and there's a distinction. But if I want to define concepts or I hear a new concept, I write it in here, and then over time I'll reiterate that definition. I might think of it differently, see it differently, or have new information. That's step one, really, is defining the big concept. Step two is then kind of deepening the understanding and refining it. Three is then linking who I heard that from, who coined the term, was it a certain speaker or a writer? That's what number two is, and it's linked to my people's database, which is just a huge CRM of people who are my collaborators and friends, as well as people from distant ages and recent history. The next thing is to create kind of a tagging system, and this is where I'd love your help if you have any feedback or cool ideas about this. So far, the only tag that I found meaningful is this thing a mental model or not? Maybe I find better tags as I find more application of this. The next thing I'll do is to basically find out who contributed to the lineage of this idea or this concept, because Darwin didn't just come up with evolution. There was a whole history behind it, and a bunch of other people who arrived at similar kind of insights and conclusions. And then also people who have taken evolution and then evolved the concept, funnily enough. So I'm tracking who contributed to that also in the lineage tag. Then over time, if I come back, I'll change my depth of understanding. Maybe it's a 2 now, it'll be a 3 later. I'm a 5 and I feel like I've mastered this concept and I could do a whole talk on it. I'll get to that later. Other cool things include tagging to areas. Now, if you haven't seen my video on how my system is set up, I use areas not just for personal and business areas, but also research areas. So I also use them in some way like a tag. As you can see, this concept is related to psychology, some of them are related to anthropology, others to cognitive science. And so I tag which area that concept belongs to. Some of them belong in multiple, like exaptation is a cognitive science term as well as being an evolutionary theory thing. So on the right is a list of all the focus areas, the things that I'm trying to focus on, concepts that I want to try and build depth in, and that's just a cute, slightly aesthetic thing, which looks nice and keeps me focused. If I'm not learning in those things, then I'm less interested in them. Da 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 da. And then it's cool just having these definitions, but what are we going to do with them? One way in which this is useful is to go through this kind of process, which Tiago Forte lays out in a cute diagram over here. You can find this on Forte Labs, where you go from seeing and observing stuff in the world, whether that be through interviews and surveys, to writing about it, or drawing, or performing and speaking at a TED Talk, or producing an artifact, and then maybe even being paid for it, either selling it or collaborating and using it in your knowledge work in some way. And so really this is kind of the starting point of me seeing and defining things, or maybe even writing about them. And from here, I can start to think about which different areas I want to apply it in. Do I want to take these concepts and weave them together in different ways? I want to write a blog post about them and speak about just that topic, in which case I've got a great definition and can go into depth about it. So why are we doing this? It's because listening to a podcast doesn't necessarily mean that you understand something. Reading a book maybe doesn't even necessarily mean that you understand something. Really, we have to go through this process of digesting information. And this is what the LINX is for. Processing and digesting is number one, but number two is a deepening of understanding. And what do I mean by that? So if you look up here, I made a cute, loving this word cute right now. It's definitely the descriptive word for today. New template. And if I click new concept, then I get 3 little boxes. And these are the questions that I kind of have to ask. First, I have to define the thing, and I'll come on and update that over time. And then I'm also asking myself examples of where I can observe the effects of this and the implications of the concept in the world. So I'm trying to ground it in things that I observe and see, and what that does to things around it. And then also linking it to like really great examples, articles, and work on this topic. So the first thing is me getting clear on the idea. The second thing is then me trying to see it in the world and build it into reality. And then the third thing is trying to build in these kind of social components of learning. And this is really hooking back to what I first introduced at the start. This, like examples of great work in this area, and then also the lineage and also the coined by who in my personal CRM are all kind of attempts to build this personal relationship into my learning, so that it's not just wrestling with abstract concept A, but if I understand the person and where they were from, the context and the time in which they grew up, I'm building this relationship with them in a way, and then maybe even with their collaborators and peers. I'm trying to understand, well, who was Darwin collaborating with, and who could I learn from next to Darwin who could give me a different angle and insight on this thing. That's really what I'm trying to look for, because I learn in that way. I want to know why Freud was like Freud. I want to know why Carl Jung was like Carl Jung, and I find Jung to be a fascinating person. I'm much more invested in learning about the concepts that he talks about because he's an interesting guy. So instead of learning about something just abstractly, I'm trying to tie it to the person. That's one way in which I'm deepening the understanding. And then what I think is really great about the LINX is that in defining these terms and seeing the lineages in which they touch and seeing the ways that they affect the world around us, we can start to move from a basic understanding to a more profound understanding. And that generally comes when you can generate plausibility with your understanding. You generate new ideas and you can speak to the way that that concept intersects with other domains. So one way you see this a lot is in economics. There's a lot of overlap with some concepts in evolution. By deepening understanding of these in their kind of vertical fields and domains, and then figuring out how they touch the world and play with the world, then we can also start to see how they intersect. And this is really what the LINX is tuned for. If you have any improvements that I could make to it, any suggestions, then let me know. If you want a copy of this, also just comment below and I'll get one to you. I'd love to hear more about how you guys are approaching your learning. I hope this has been helpful in some way, and keen to connect in any way. Just drop us a line anytime. Ciao.